Welcome to the Project Hummingbird House podcast, where we are attempting to shine a light onto the most severe of the spectrum, while at the same time giving a bit of understanding to everybody. Welcome to episode 1 of our new Project Hummingbird House podcast. Today we are introducing a Twitch gamer called Armskiller V2. I am Kendra Robillard, director of Project Hummingbird House. Enjoy the show.
Hello. I'm overrated.
Or also overrated. At the forefront of my mind was the neurodiversity movement, because that's what we've been kind of poking holes at. And instead of arguing with them, I thought we could break it down kind of with the premises. So the neurodiversity mob has made the claim that non-autistics cannot comment on those on the spectrum because they don't have any idea how to empathize or how to articulate what those on the spectrum actually feel or actually encounter in their day-to-day lives. I would say that that premise falls rather short of the fact that empathy is kind of a great skill set that we have developed, and I would ask, what do you think?
I think it's a very self-centered idea. It's only I know what's best for everyone else, you know?
Or even only I know what's best for me, and me alone. Me alone can only decide what's best for me. But when me doesn't understand how to articulate what me is feeling, it can present itself in difficult forms.
Yeah, but even then, it's just, when it comes to neurodiversity movement, to me, it looks like it's people using their own experiences to try and dictate everyone else's experiences. Which, to me, I despise the idea. I despise that idea. Because, and to me, it's, your experiences are very individual. And to try and proclaim that your experiences then override everyone else's experiences just because you are this or that, to me is very arrogant, to say the least.
I would agree. I would only agree because we understand that science is the great be-all, end-all, where if you have many different voices trying to prove each other wrong, then it tells you what true things are. And when you have perspectives, emotions, feelings, biases, all of these things, it's hard to come out with a true answer. That's why in courts, first-hand testimony of how you feel or anecdotal experiences is often thrown out because they can be molded and shaped by your biases and what you're trying to project versus what you actually feel. And your memories can often change, especially when you keep trying to access and tap into them. You remember things not correct, but you think they're correct, but they're not.
Memories are a very unreliable thing. It can change on a whim.
And so the fact that we're using this to predict policy without an actual true reading, I think is going to be short-lived in the long term, and it's going to...
I think it's going to hurt everybody that it's pertaining to. I think it will hurt both those that are more severe on the spectrum, and then those like myself that can lead normal lives in spite of it. Because on the one hand, it's holding back the potential of those that may have a more difficult time adjusting to
regular neurotypical life, as they would call it, or what is normal, only a setting on the dryer.
But that's just it. They'll proclaim that there's a blurred line with normal, but then they will then proclaim that a group is normal, and then they will actively try and avoid it. If there's no normal, then what's the problem with neurotypicals?
Fair. And I think even some neurotypicals have difficulty processing. I remember when I was first learning about the spectrum and about atypical, and I was learning first about what stimming is, what stimming does, and why they stim to process. And neurotypicals stim, just like atypicals do. If you've ever flicked a pen on your desk, or played with your hair with your finger, or shaking your leg over and 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 over again, that's stimming. It's just neurotypicals hold back because they realize that they're probably bothering everybody else in the office. So we have that threshold that we won't pass, whereas an atypical doesn't. I suppose that was the wrong word. Not necessarily doesn't, but in the beginning needs to learn what that threshold is and why it's there.
Yeah. Because regardless of who you are, you're gonna have to learn what people's boundaries are, and sometimes it results in crossing them.
Correct. And the way social norms are, the way other people react to things, they're unwritten rules that aren't written down on a piece of paper that says, don't do this, because it's going to change depending on. So you have all these unwritten rules. And for an atypical that doesn't have those built into them already, have to learn those, and they can't just read on a piece of paper what to do. So while a neurotypical can watch, mimic, and learn with the nonverbal communication that we have between each other, an atypical, it may just go noom, right over the head. Just noom.
Yeah. Well, it's simply a lot more difficult to get a bead on non-verbal cues, and hell, even verbal cues. You know, how someone says something, which could change the context of a conversation, may fly over some atypicals' heads, Well, not some, many.
And then, of course, the question and debate comes down to, should atypicals have to learn these standards that we've created, these unwritten rules? Should they have to learn, and should they have to constantly be learning these so that they can get along in the world, or should we just accept them as they are, just plainly as they are? I would argue that, yes, we have them for a reason. These norms are there for a reason. So, for example, if you want to work in an office, you can't disrupt the office because it disrupts productivity. Thusly, those social norms are there for an actual reason. And we can't tear them all down just because there are atypicals. Atypicals have a bar that they must meet, just like neurotypicals have a bar they must meet.
And it's also forgetting about the fact that neurotypicals also have to learn these social cues and these social norms. It's not just the atypicals. It's like, sure, it's more difficult for atypicals to grasp at these social norms, but neurotypicals don't just pick it up and say, "Hey, I've got this." They have to learn. They have to expose themselves to potentially uncomfortable situations. And sure, if they have to expose themselves to uncomfortable experiences, why can't an atypical do the same thing?
I guess it's managing expectations. And which expectations we should expect, and which ones should we be more lax about. And I worry that we are trying to reset the rules and be lax about everything to the point where standards are no longer a thing, and that standards are harmful. And I wonder what harm they mean other than uncomfortability, which neurotypicals face that too. I remember growing up as a neurotypical because I've had a late diagnosis. I'm 36, and now they've given me, oh, you're a high-functioning autistic now. And I'm like, oh, that's great. But I remember as a kid, if you were too obnoxious, people didn't want to be around you. If you were a tattletale, a rat, a snitch, you didn't have any friends. If you didn't dress a certain way, you didn't have any friends. If you didn't do certain things, you didn't have any friends. And the thought of being alone overwhelmed people. That's why everybody wants to be cool. The neurotypicals all want to be cool because they want to be liked. They want to be part of the crowd. And so you have to learn not to be obnoxious. You got to learn to temper your voice. You got to learn to temper your emotions. You can't be a crybaby. You can't be a tattletale. And if you followed the rules too well, you were a goody-goody two-shoes or a teacher's pet, and that was also wrong. And so there's all these unwritten rules that you have to follow, and you have to get confidence at, and nobody tells you in advance. You have to learn by people not wanting to be around you suddenly to learn that you've...
Sometimes it's just a matter of look at who you're talking to and try to understand them and where they're coming from. Sometimes it's down to learning about the individual that you are communicating with and what things they might enjoy talking about, what things they don't. And at that point, it is throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks. For instance, you're not gonna talk. Like, it sounds bad, but you're not gonna talk to someone in the same way that you'll talk to someone else. You're not gonna talk to a complete stranger how you're gonna talk to your friends. You're not gonna talk to your friends how you talk to your family. It's all different. Even in that, there are a lot of different rules.
Oh,
and
yeah.
There are different boundaries set by. It can be anywhere from the type of people you're talking to just the individual. There are subjects that you just do not approach because sometimes it's because you don't fully. It could just be that you don't necessarily know them well enough to be able to talk about those subjects without pushing past the boundary that they have set.
It's like when you're in a group of guys and suddenly the edgiest, cuttiest, worst, dirtiest, naughtiest language, you use that all the time because you want to just say the edgiest thing for everybody to go, oh, yeah, and then you talk to a girl and suddenly you've curbed everything and you're suddenly nice and sweet and polite and you're nervous and you're like, oh God, don't offend her, don't offend her, don't offend her, don't offend her.
Yeah, don't say the wrong thing, otherwise I might get into significant amounts of trouble.
Correct. And it's all of that language that is just difficult in general. And what standards do we need to maintain and which ones do we need to wipe out? I also find that the premise that not being an atypical means you can't understand or can't look through their eyes or can't walk in their shoes, that isolates parents as well. It means that moms don't understand their children, even though moms might actually be the ones that understand them better than themselves.
I will actually go as, if they are going to use that logic, I'll go as far as to say that because they don't understand that specific, how autism specifically affects an individual, so why are they then, so they don't know anything about anyone else's autism. Why are they then trying to get into or trying to dictate how others should be treated based on something that they may not have any idea about?
I would almost, when everybody comes in and says, every autistic is an individual, which means individually every autistic is different. And then I go, okay, just like every neurotypical is different.
Yeah.
So in other words is we're all kind of the same. I don't have the same taste on my tongue that you do. I don't have the same touch, same smell that you do, and yet somehow we can find commonalities between each other. Why can't it be the same for a neurotypical and an atypical?
I think that's it. I think to get to know people like that, it requires you actually getting to know them. It requires that you talk to them and that you discuss with them and that you learn things from them. For instance, I've made many friends. I've made neurotypical friends. I've made atypical friends. But simply put, they probably understand enough about me because I've just simply spoken to them. They know my idiosyncrasies. I understand theirs. It does not require you be atypical to understand me. If anything, it's kind of a requirement that you get to know someone before you then try and speak on their behalf. I think the idea of speaking on someone's behalf when you don't exactly know them, or you don't necessarily understand what might be best for them, is not, and I'm throwing these words like arrogant, condescending, and all that, but that's really the only thing I can think of. It is assuming that you know better. Like, people do, to the high-functioning autists that might listen to this, you don't know me. You don't know me just because I'm autistic. Just as I don't know you because you're also autistic. That's not how that works. It requires a degree of social cohesion there. And this is why I commonly stick to the rule of I will do nothing but represent myself as an if I am talking in regards of autism or anything really, because now that's not to say that using my experiences could not help anyone, because I like to think I've helped a few people by sharing my experiences, but all in all, I represent myself, and I do not speak for every autist.
And then, of course, we come to the problem, which is policy. Because when we're affecting policy for people, we need to take what everybody has in common and then affect policy on the commonalities. I think the problem that we're running into is the spectrum in and of itself. So when we're trying to affect policy that will help those that are on the spectrum, we take the commonalities, the common issues, and then we deal with those. But I find that low functioning and high functioning, what is in common with low functioning and what is in common with high functioning, are not in unison with each other, but in fact contradict each other quite significantly. And so I wonder if the problem isn't necessarily the policy or isn't necessarily the people representing policy, but the fact that we are including both in such a wide spectrum, where those that have things in common that, say with my son, who is a nonverbal, would not necessarily have things in common with a high functioning like you.
Yeah. Because in spite of the commonalities, you cannot treat your kid in the way that, in a way that I've been treated. Because it just simply wouldn't be as effective. And vice versa. If I was treated like in the way that your son was being treated, I'd find that incredibly condescending. And in that regard, you are absolutely right. There definitely needs to be more clarification between those the more severe end of the spectrum and people like myself, which, and you're right, policy often fails to do.
Yeah, policy often covers the majority. And so the minority gets lumped into that umbrella, and unfortunately it does an extreme disservice. And I find that the disservice can actually be the difference between brain damage and not. So, for example, your outbursts as a child would look much different than my son's outbursts right now.
Even between someone of a similar, on the similar end of the spectrum to me, would have had a completely different outburst. For instance, I was more initially I was more outwardly aggressive. I would hit, I'd bite, I'd do all those kinds of things. I am still very sorry to the people who I did that towards. Then again, I was 4 or 5, and even then, how my outbursts work now, even in comparison to back then, now I remove myself and I try and find a space on my own so I can calm down and get right back into it. Even as it's not even just how one changes as they grow up is also another factor that a lot of people don't seem to understand.
You have the cognitive ability to learn that, okay, I need to remove myself. Whereas my son would need to be told.
Yeah.
And then repeat it until it becomes something that he just does. Because he's not going to have the cognitive function to understand the difference and to remove himself. So he needs to be taught that skill, and it needs to be generalized so that it becomes second nature to him.
Yeah.
And so I would say that my approach with somebody like you would definitely look completely different than one to my son. Because my son, unfortunately, we have to use smaller language and we have to use smaller step as if they were a child. Whereas to you, you'd be like, "Hey, don't talk to me like that. I'm 9. Come on now, I'm not 2. What are you doing?
Exactly.
Treating me like I'm stupid."
Exactly. It's how you'd get me to learn something is to just simply explain it. Whereas with someone like your son, it would be breaking it down step by step. It's not as simple. For instance, I say something rude, you can just tell me, "You're being a little bit rude, can you dial it down a little?" But,
But Jack wouldn't understand that kind of language. I could look at him and be like, "Yo, what you did, seriously? No, that doesn't work here, and this is why," and then I explain why. Now that doesn't mean he can't learn, and that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. What that means is our approach should be completely different. And so I think the contention between those that have nonverbal autistics and those that are high functioning, I think it's that it's almost like we're speaking a different language. Because we talk to each other and we get angry with each other and we say, "You're wrong. You're wrong. No, you're wrong. No, you're wrong. No, you're wrong." When actually, two things might be true at once.
Yeah, you might be right. I just don't know, because that doesn't, just because it doesn't necessarily work for me doesn't mean it won't work for you.
I remember I asked you once, before you met me and before you knew my son, did you really know how deep the spectrum went? Did you really understand that there were kids like my son? Did you know any of them?
I knew people similar to him, but I didn't quite understand it. Because there's one thing seeing a low-functioning autistic kid, but and how this was also a major issue I had for quite some time, and that was assuming that I was...
Seeing it and then kind of living it is definitely two things, because when you're high functioning and you look at a kid like my son, you're thinking, why don't you just explain it to him? Why don't you just give him a chance to work it out for himself? Until you realize that's not what's going to happen. He can't. He just can't. Now, most people will say that's perceived intelligence, but we need to understand what reality actually is, because there's empathy and then there's understanding reality. And whether we like it or not, we have to understand reality as it is, not as we want it to be. Then there's the issue of ABA. Now, I have noticed the correlation with ABA's abuse is a lot of it is high functioners, and I'm wondering if ABA in and of itself is abuse, or were you just cognitively high functioning, and so a lot of ABA's tactics seemed like they were treating you like you were stupid. And I wonder if that maybe is the difference on why people say this is abuse, this is the harm that it does, because we were using a therapy that should be primarily for those that are more severely affected on the spectrum. Now, when the diagnosis is before 5, I don't think you know how severe the spectrum is really affecting them, because you don't have a complete picture of high functioning or low functioning when a child is 2. So, for example, when you first got diagnosed, you would have been a nonverbal autistic, but you're a high functioner. You were able to become verbal. You were able to understand concepts and to understand your own autonomy and to understand how to make certain choices in life, whereas my son wouldn't, and they wouldn't have been able to see that full picture until after 5. Now, the problem with the low functioning on the spectrum is immediate intervention is necessary. And I wonder if, because we can't see that full picture, that the contention with ABA is simply high functioners didn't need it.
I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. I think it can still serve a function, but then again, it's more of a case of here's the thing. I don't quite know. I know I received some kind of therapy for, to get me started in life, and here's the thing. Even to this day, I don't quite understand the exact purpose of it and all of that. But when I talk to my mum about it, she will explain it, and she'll say that was probably one of the best things that could have happened to me. And I think that's really it. It's if I'm using my experiences to figure out a reason, it would be that at the time you don't necessarily understand what's going on, even if it is helping you, even if there is significant improvement. Hell, when I was younger, I would look back and say, oh, they didn't do anything for me, this and that. But the reality is they probably did more for me than I would ever know. That's because that was my routine. That was just the life I had at, when I was younger.
I know that, a lot of the high functioners that I've butted heads with, and I'm starting to have a little bit more of an understanding for their point of view, I will say, just because I've tried to understand why they come about it that way, is they'll say, I wanted to be doing these things that all the other kids were doing, but instead I had to go and do this thing, and I didn't want to, and I hated it, and it sucked, and it made me feel uncomfortable, and it made me feel overstimulated, and it made my senses go crazy, but they made me do it anyways, and I wish they didn't, because I wanted to be like all the other kids doing what those kids were doing, and instead I was with this therapist doing these things. Gah! And so, from hindsight, you only see your side of the window, but you don't see the ultimate purpose for what was happening, and you don't see it from your parents' perspective, where it's like, okay, you need to adjust things, because if you don't, then you're going to have a harder time in life.
I will straight up say this. When I was younger and in school, I'm pretty sure a lot of kids would have actually been jealous of the stuff that I was doing in those lessons. Because I was in a special class with other autistics. Some were somewhat more high functioning, but others were severe. As in non-verbal. But yeah, it's simply, lightheartedness aside, it's simply I did not recognize how it helped me. And I doubt many people actually understand how something may help them or improve themselves, if you get what I mean.
Oh, I get what you mean. I'm one of the rare few that can remember my school experience. And when I see some of the things that Jack gets to do during school hours, I'm like, oh my god, if I got to do that, that would be the greatest vacation from school ever. Like, you get to go into a room full of balls. You get to sit in a room of balls, and you get to just play around in there, and really what's happening is you're learning to regulate your senses, whereas I could do it naturally. So to me, I'm like, that looks like you're just playing with a bunch of balls. Why didn't I get to do that?
But there is something to be learned from it. There used to be... I remember very frequently we used to do a lot of cooking and baking in those kinds of classes. And this was before I went into mainstream education, when all I needed was a teaching assistant. Because, I was simply one of those few that eventually did transition from that special class into main school, and it's a very different dynamic. It's a very different environment.
It's very demanding too.
Yeah, it really is. You go into the special classes that I did, and it's very simple. And at the time, I wouldn't have thought it was condescending. For me, it was just, I'm there doing this. Nowadays, I could say, I could think about it. This was this. They were treating me as if I was, But at the time, and even then, and even after the fact, I most likely am better off as a result of it. It's simply, I don't think I'll fully actually understand how much they really helped me.
They helped you process a lot of things so that the high demands of mainstream school, mainstream, right? My articulation is affected completely being on the spectrum, but okay.
By the end of secondary school, I wanted to scream.
Exactly. And if you had gone in there without the emotional regulatory system being built, without all of these building blocks to get you there, you would have walked in and went, oh my god, and then got run over.
Without the ability to even say a thing.
Yeah, you would have got bulldozed over.
Not only bulldozed. There would be no functioning in school. I wouldn't be able to do anything, sure, and...
It gave you the ability to learn.
Yeah, it kind of did.
I know that the beginning stages of ABA for my son, the first thing we focused on is him being able to sit in his damn desk and do something. And it was in tandem, not only just to sit in his damn desk, but also a sensory diet, because it is really hard to read when you're flapping. It's hard to get your shoes on when you're flapping. It's hard to get your shirt on when you're clapping. It's hard to get your pants on when you're body rocking. It's hard to do all of these things. And so we did both regulatory processing in tandem with stim diet so that you didn't have to stim constantly. You could hold it, and you could hold it in for a certain period of time. And when you're about to explode, boom, we give you the chance to flap, and then you could take off like a helicopter. And to a lot of people, that's like, oh my god, if stimming is like how you process the world, we can't stop you from doing it, right? Well, no, you can't. But what we can do is put a little bit of a hold on there. So it's like a smoker. It's like a smoker. A smoker, when they first get when they get their first job, and they have to learn to go without a cigarette until their damn break. And then on the break, they're like, I'm going to chain smoke 5 smokes. Oh shit, I got to go back to work. And you put it out and you go in, and you got to learn not to have a nicotine fit against all your other coworkers because you want a damn cigarette, but you can't smoke inside while you're working at McDonald's.
Imagine an emergency situation where something serious is going down. At that moment, you cannot let emotions override the logical side of things. You have to deal with the emergency situation. And the moment you know that that situation is over and done with, you can let it all out. Just let the stress out, let the frustration out, just calm down, and yeah. Sometimes there's a time and a place for everything. And to just let your emotions take over you whenever you feel like it can be dangerous.
It can be, yes. I remember when I had a fire and I lost my mind. Now, if I had used ABA for myself to say, okay, calm down, get the fire extinguisher. In that moment, I could have saved myself a lot of pain. But instead, I panicked. Oh my god, fire, run. And instead, had I practiced, okay, there's a fire, this is what we do. That's why, actually, in school, we have fire drills. So even neurotypicals do something over and over and over until it's second nature. We use ABA in our regular lives all the time. With autism, we tighten it up and increase the intensity of it to try and use the same kind of response so that, for example, when you need to learn things, you say, okay, we're going to put stimming on hold. You're going to hold it in, kind of like a smoker not being able to smoke. You're going to hold it in and see how long we can get you to go without stimming. And once we have that window, we know for my son, it's now it's up to 30 minutes. So we got 30 minutes of learning, and then stim diet, where you stim to your heart's content for 5-10 minutes, or you go to the sensory room, or you go wherever and you regulate yourself out, and then you come back and you take a breather and we do it again. And that way you're ready to learn, or you're ready to do what you need to do in an emergency situation. You're ready to take on the world because you have the tools at your disposal to do it. And a lot of people will say it's like dog training, which it is. It can be. It has a lot of commonalities. That's because dog brains are tinier, but they still learn in the same kind of ways that people do. A lot of people will say that it's that we're turning atypicals into neurotypicals, into cookie cutter shaped human beings that we can just stamp next, stamp next, stamp next. We're not trying to turn them into anything. We're trying, that's distilled down into a one-sentence definition. What we're doing is giving them the building blocks and the foundation so that they can move beyond their autism and accomplish better things than they could have had they stayed the way they are.
But then my rebuke to the argument that they are trying to make them into neurotypicals is that alright, and you're trying to reinforce their atypical nature. It's a very simple argument to fall, purely because, by that very same logic, it's... Alright, so you're trying to reinforce bad habits.
They want the whole world to conform to be atypical instead of invoking standards, because those standards are difficult. And so they think the difficulty to get there is harm.
Then again, life is difficult.
Yes, people do things they don't like to do every day, whether they're neurotypical or atypical or monkey-typical, whatever they are. Life is always going to have challenges, and you can either choose to bite the bullet and overcome those challenges, or you can say, no, I'm this way, this challenge is going to stay the way it is.
Yeah, and even in my own experiences, burying one's head in the sand isn't exactly the greatest idea.
Yes, and as parents, we want our children to fly. And not necessarily meaning they're going to be the greatest kid in the world and take over the world, but we want them to have so many doors open and so many paths they can take that they get to have the most variety in their choices, so that no doors are shut simply because they're atypical. We want to keep all those doors open for them, so that they can choose which one to walk through. So that if they want to get married, they have the opportunity to. If they want kids, they have the opportunity to. If they want to stay a bachelor, they have the opportunity to. If they want dignity, they have the opportunity for that. If they want a career, there's the opportunity. But how do you keep all of those doors open if you don't invoke standards and work to get to them?
Well, it's if we rely on our emotional impulses, then nothing. Well, like I said, it's dangerous.
The world would be chaos.
Not just chaos, but on an individual level, it would ultimately, it would result in a lot of dangerous things happening. You know, I can't quite explain it, but if one allows their emotions to override everything, it will only go on to hurt more than help. Because there are times where emotions should not be a part of the equation. And I understand that that sounds, that could sound bad, but there really are situations that are beyond you, the individual. And if, sometimes it's not about you. Sometimes you have to realize that some situations go beyond you, and to make it about you will do more to worsen or escalate that situation.
I think you have a lot of wisdom on this subject. I really do. I think you have a lot more wisdom on this subject than you might think. I think a lot of people have a lot to learn just by listening to you talk about these things.
I have a lot to learn.
On that note, I'm going to wrap it up here and say thank you for listening. And next episode is going to be with parents, so that we can shine a light onto the most severe of the spectrum and see if we can find better solutions. Thanks for listening.